Welcome, everyone. Oh, that was perfect. Perfectly synchronized. Look at that. I'm Sylvia Yount, the Lawrence A. Fleischman Curator in charge of the American Wing, and I'm very privileged to introduce tonight's program marking the send-off of a special installation that we've had on view in the wing since the fall and which closes actually on Tuesday, the 28th. So I'm glad you could be here tonight to hear about this program and hear about the installation. The installation is entitled Crossings, and it's the second part of an auspicious display that was planned around our recent Winslow-Homer Cross Currents exhibition. And it's taking place actually in the American Wing Gallery that formerly held or normally houses our Homer paintings, which are coming back on view just in the next week or so. But with those on the road, we were able to pursue a strategic installation of loaned works by key modern and contemporary artists. First, Kerry James Marshall, Kara Walker, and Hugh Hayden, then Walker and Robert Colescott, works that reckon with two iconic historical paintings in our collection, Homer's The Gulf Stream and Emanuel Leutze's Washington Crossing the Delaware. And it's the latter, of course, that is part of what brings us together tonight. Soon after the Lucas Museum of American Art made the record-setting acquisition in May 2021 of Colescott's searing and subversive reimagining of Leutze's epic, George Washington Carver Crossing the Delaware, page from an American history textbook, Lucas director and my former Met colleague, Sandra Jackson-Dumont, and I seemingly almost simultaneously decided we had a very exciting opportunity to create a dialogue between these works that continue to spark debate about the biases of American history and myth-making. And this was particularly relevant as for close to now a decade in the American Wing, which is the Met's historical department of wide-ranging architectural elements, decorative arts, painting, sculpture, and works on paper by African-American, Euro-American, Latin American, and Native American artists. In the Wing, we've been evolving our collecting focus and gallery narratives to be ever more inclusive. And in the process, we've brought critical perspectives to bear on our canonic holdings, which we still revere, like works by Homer and Leutze, as well as newer acquisitions, especially by women and artists of color, in ways that really allow us to explore truthful histories and their consequential legacies. It's been a great pleasure to work with Sandra and her Lucas team on the Colescott loan, as well as tonight's program. And I'm very pleased to now turn the podium over to her so she can share more about the painting and also introduce tonight's panelists. So thank you all for coming.
Hello, everyone. Yes, hello. I missed this space. Thank you, Sylvia, for being an outstanding partner and colleague, and also a welcomed kind of critic of what it means to be American through the lens of the incredible collection here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I also want to thank Max Holine for just being an incredible colleague, but also just a great director when I was here. And finally, I want to thank also our colleagues from the Lucas Museum and those here from the Met. I appreciate them dearly. And then thank you all for being here, above all. This is a bit of a homecoming for me, as many of you can see as I kiss and hug people, probably slightly inappropriately, you know, in terms of like COVID. That's only in terms of COVID. And I used to be chairman of education here at this museum and spent a great deal of time introducing and framing what we really consider very powerful and timely conversations and presentations and performances here on this very stage at this very podium. I've always been deeply interested in making art and museums irresistible to people, and in my former role here, I enjoyed challenging people's assumptions about this place, the history of the Met, and it always has been, in so many ways, progressive, and now marks another moment where it's showing itself to be that. I've always delighted in telling people, oops, sorry, wrong way. I've always delighted in telling people being an archive digger myself, that the legendary singer and pianist Nina Simone performed on this stage, yes, in 1969 during the Harlem on My Mind exhibition here. She depicted on February 4th, where the crowd was so big that they had to add 100 seats to the stage. So this is you looking at the stage as if you were there. I am now the director and CEO of the Lucas Museum of Narrative Art, a new museum under construction in Los Angeles, South Central, South Los Angeles. And the focus is, it's the first museum to focus exclusively on storytelling through imagery. This is a rendering of the building as if you were standing across the street. The Lucas Museum of Narrative Art takes an inclusive approach to visual storytelling, exploring academically rooted and mass-produced art forms, as well as new modes of creative practice. We operate on the belief that visual storytelling can connect us to create and help shape a more just society. We are thrilled to collaborate on this program on the occasion of the Lucas Museum's Robert Colescott painting being on view here in the American Wing. It is in direct dialogue with the work that it both was that inspired it, but also that it felt like it was in criticism of. In my mind, this painting is one of the most important examples of narrative art in American history. In the words of Lowery Stokes Sims, who you will hear from in just a moment, this work radically rewrites the American national self-mythology, parodying the grandeur of historical genre paintings while exposing the structural racial divides of the United States. End quote. All of that in one beautiful painting. It is my pleasure to now introduce our speakers tonight. Rashid Johnson is an influential American artist whose work is known for embedding a pointed range of everyday materials and objects, often associated with his childhood and frequently referencing collective aspects of African-American intellectual history and cultural identity. With shamanistic inspiration from both African-American and art history, many of his more recent works employ materials in a way that suggests an indefinite form of mysticism and a role as devotional objects. He received his BA in photography from Columbia College in Chicago and studied for his MFA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Recent solo exhibitions of his works have been presented at Hauser and Wirth, London, and New York, Aspen Art Museum. There's so many, I could go on. I'm sorry, Rashid, there's just so many shows that he's done, it's amazing. So I'm gonna move on to Lowery. Dr. Lowery Stokes Sims is an American art historian and curator. Lowery is a specialist in modern and contemporary art, craft, and design, and is known for her particular interest in a diverse and inclusive global art world. She retired as curator emerita from the Museum of Art and Design in 2015. For over 20 years, she served on the education and curatorial staff here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. She is this museum's first Black curator. From 2000 to 2007, she was the executive director, president, and adjunct curator at the Studio Museum in Harlem. She recently guest curated exhibitions at the Caribbean Cultural Center, African Diasporic Institute, Grounds for Sculpture, and she also is someone who has so many accolades under her belt that it's too much to mention, but I will mention this recent one. In 2021 to 2022, she was the Kress Beinecke Professor at the Center for Advanced Study in the Visual Arts, also known as CASVA, at the National Gallery of Art. To be clear, there is not a single conversation about Robert Colescott that would be complete without her voice being at the table and her scholarship being there. The moderator for this evening is Akili Tommasino, Associate Curator of Modern Contemporary Art here at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. I'm so happy to say that. He is actually such an incredible scholar. Previously, Akili held curatorial positions at the Museum of Fine Arts Boston and the Museum of Modern Art here in New York. A former Fulbright Fellow at the Centre Pompidou, he is a PhD candidate at Harvard University where he earned his MA and BA. I'd like to ask you to join me in welcoming this incredibly esteemed and monumental group of people to the table.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Sandra, for that great introduction. Before posing some questions for our speakers to discuss about Robert Colescott's George Washington Crossing the Delaware, I would like to briefly focus on the figure of George Washington Carver. In Colescott's 1975 painting, Carver is dressed like Leutze's George Washington in revolutionary military uniform with a tricorn hat and a sword at his hilt. In Colescott's preparatory drawing for this painting, Dr. Carver wears a lab coat and holds a test tube or beaker in one hand and a bag of peanuts in the other, much more familiar garb and accessories associated with Dr. Carver. Dr. George Washington Carver's work studying the cultivation of peanuts resulted in the creation of more than 300 products from peanuts, contributing greatly to the economic resurgence of the rural South during the early first half of the 20th century in the United States. This look from the spring 2021 couture collection of designer Kirby John Raymond's Pure Moss, which paid homage to Black innovators, underscores the outsized role of Carver's experiments with peanuts in how he is remembered. However, Carver was not only an agricultural scientist and prolific inventor, he was an artist. When Dr. George Washington Carver was born, Dr. George Washington Carver was born enslaved in Diamond Grove, Missouri on July 12, 1864, near the end of the Civil War. In his brief 1897 autobiographical essay, Carver wrote that, quote, "From a child, I had an inordinate desire for knowledge, and especially music, painting, flowers, and the sciences, algebra being one of my favorite studies. As a sickly youth, he could not perform heavy farm chores, so he was given liberty to use much of his time as he wished, and he chose to explore the wonders of nature, observing and talking to flowers, asking questions of their properties. Carver's thirst for knowledge drove him to put himself through multiple schools by working as a cook and launderer for room and board. Upon completing high school, he gained admission to Highland College in Highland, Kansas, but when he arrived on campus, he was turned away on account of the color of his skin. The school didn't know that he was Black when they accepted him. Eventually, he settled in Winterset, Iowa, where he took on a job as a cook in a large hotel and made acquaintances that encouraged him to resume his education. In 1890, Carver enrolled at Simpson College to study art and piano. After transferring to Iowa State Agricultural and Mechanical College, he embarked in earnest on his mission to improve the lives of farmers throughout the field of experimental agriculture. Eventually, he would accept Booker T. Washington's invitation to establish a Department of Agricultural Research at the fledgling Tuskegee University. But Dr. Carver never stopped making art. In 1893, several of his paintings were exhibited at Chicago's World Fair, and he received honorable mention. In 1941, reporting on the dedication of the George Washington Carver Museum at the Tuskegee Institute, which featured a display of over 70 of his paintings, dubbed him the Black Leonardo. Carver's paintings are unique because he made all of his pigments using Alabama soils. Moreover, Carver rediscovered the formula for ancient Egyptian blue, the knowledge of which had been lost for hundreds of years. And I just want to acknowledge here that I first learned about Carver's career as an artist through the final body of work of the phenomenal multidisciplinary artist Terry Adkins. So to bring us back to the Met, I thought we could kick off our conversation by considering a question posed by Robert Colescott himself about his iconic work. In 1981, he wrote, "My idea was to use the Leutze painting to talk about another kind of history. To pair off that token representation, the textbooks have allowed us, George Washington Carver and Booker T. Washington, with the overwhelming impact of popular and media stereotypes of Blacks before the Civil Rights Movement. What does this whole switch do to the original?" So, Dr. Sims, what does this switch do to both the Leutze painting and the image of George Washington Carver?
It makes it better. I think Bob often talked about he wanted to interject blacks into art history. But it wasn't simply a black-facing or sort of replacing, you know, the characters with black figures in the same poses. He wanted to sort of make a comment, I think, in this painting, not only about class and recognition, you know, of black achievement, but also to really have us question what essentially the stereotypical images of blacks represented, you know, in terms of who we are and what we are. When I was coming up and sort of first learning about Bob's work, I was like really puzzled about what you do with, you know, these kinds of stereotypes. And I remember my friend, the great artist and one of the founders of Godzilla, Asian American artist Marco Machida, said, the thing is, Lowery, you have to own your stereotypes. And once you own your stereotypes, you're not afraid of them, because essentially stereotypes of any group of people is a takeoff on an exaggeration of inherent, you know, sort of behaviors, whether they're enforced or innate. So when you look at the work of Hogarth, you look at the work of Daumier, you can sort of see, you know, a similar kind of approach to Europeans or white people, you know, in that sense. And I think that what Bob was really doing was creating a much more heroic stature for, you know, mammy figures, cooks, farmers, coons, you know, and all the sort of basically designations of blacks that racism makes us cringe, you know, about. But so what he does in a weird kind of way, and we were talking about this backstage, is that he uses Leutze as his meme and sort of really creates, you know, like his own version of it with, you know, people that he feels a great affection for. People think that he wanted to be sensational. I don't. I think he loved every single figure that he put into the painting. And when you think about it, it raises a similar kind of class distinction that you would have had in the Leutze, because those guys rowing the boats were not Virginia aristocrats. You know, it was sort of farmers and sort of ordinary people, you know, sort of taking the great man across to defeat the Hessians and the British.
Rashid, what does the switch do to the original?
I mean, it's a great question, and it's a incredibly complicated picture. I'm still, to being honest, unpacking how George Washington Carver is a better painter than I am. So that's my first challenge. And then, of course, being here with Lowery, who I really credit with being one of the people who helped start my career, and then thinking about what's true. I'm definitely not here without Lowery being here. To set the stage and give opportunities to artists like myself. So, you know, she should get a round of applause. She's an incredibly important voice. To get back to, you know, why we're here and the Colescott picture, you know, Colescott provides an incredible dichotomy of understanding as far as how we look at pictures and picture making, stereotypes, critical concerns around race, but also the opportunity to think about and explore sexuality and black interiority. So this particular painting, of course, the George Washington crossing the Carver crossing the Delaware painting, really speaks almost to a more broad audience. Our attempts to kind of lure you in to thinking about the possibility of his project by giving you an image to which you have some familiarity, and then being able to kind of pull a bait and switch and then produce this kind of opportunity for different kinds of examination of interiority and different kind of complexities, and really kind of drive you into his project. Because as successful as this picture is, and as valuable as we've recognized that it is in so many different ways, it does still provide a place for kind of a European kind of launching spot in which to discuss Robert's work. And I think that Robert actually, in his more quiet moments, is where he tells us more about his actual kind of set of concerns. And there's so many things happening in Robert's work, things that I'd never seen explored in an artist's practice before. Kind of exploration of colorism and color and complexion. I mean, I had always seen Blackness really represented as a more monolithic experience through the work of most artists whom I'd come across, where it was like Blackness was a uniform that you could essentially put on, and it was bulletproof, and from there you could project or insinuate or explore or discover, but that it was always kind of essentially one location. And what Robert's work really teaches us is that there are so many different locations within the way that he sees Blackness, and he oftentimes almost provides color scales in some of his pictures that then kind of tell us like, oh, there's all of these different Negroes, right? And complexion is really the easiest entry point into it. He talks about class in different ways. He talks about exploration of sexuality in different kinds of ways. His work is transgressive in ways that this painting doesn't even begin to delve into, to be completely honest. So I think it's an incredible place to bring an audience to a practice, but I think the real value in a picture like this, which does have some low-hanging fruit, but also some really incredible aspirations, is that it is an opportunity to invite us into the complexity of an artist like Robert's project.
You know, and the more I think about it, I mean, I've been, working on this guy's work since 1979, and this is it. This is the last. Don't ask me to do any more lectures on Robert Colescott. If you have any ideas, this is it. I think that, Black people look at this painting and they take the stereotypes very personally, but it ain't about us. It's about what white people might secretly think who we are. So it's on white people to sort of really dissect what their feelings are about Black people. And by putting Carver into the picture, he sort of says to us that, this is, as Rashid is talking about, this is not a monolithic, kind of situation. This is the kind of Black person that you would accept, maybe marginally. And these are the kinds that you disparage. But each one of those, represents something that's about you and how you feel about the situation. So I really, after thinking about this a long time, I really don't personalize, the stereotypes a lot. Although I have to sort of confess that when I published the article in 1984 on Art Forum, and my mother looked at the cover and looked at the picture and realized that there was a woman filleting a man, she didn't talk to me for a month after that.
Dr. Sims, you just mentioned that you've been working on Colescott since, 1976? When did you first encounter his work, and what compelled you to helm two retrospectives of his work, 1987, or 1989 rather, and in 2019?
Well, actually, it was Henry Gelzel, the first curator of contemporary art, who took me down to Semaphore Gallery to see his work. And Henry, we had a cordial relationship, but I never thought that Henry really gave a damn about what I was looking at and stuff. But he said one day, come on, I'm gonna take a cab, and he takes me down, and I walk into the gallery, and I look at these paintings, and I go, holy shit. And I think it was the transgression of the paintings that really appealed to me. Let me put that into context. I was raised middle class, Black, girl, Catholic, very well behaved, born in 1949, taught in the 50s and 60s of the need to assimilate and act in a certain way to gain acceptance by the larger society. And then I sort of began to look around and realize that all the values that were being imposed on me were being transgressed daily by all around me. So I did, but I knew you had to play by the game, so I didn't let anybody know that I was like checking the whole situation out. I walk into the gallery and there is a man who's saying exactly what I'm thinking about society in general, attitudes towards sexuality, attitude towards blackness, attitude towards what is proper. I also think that, you have to remember that in the 70s and 80s, we were in the context of postmodernism, deconstructing the canon. There were all these words like quality, excellence, value that were being bandied about. And they were used to bludgeon artists of color to sort of say that artists of color were not good enough, even though they'd gone to the same academies, had the same teachers, were the teachers, in that sense. So when I walked into Colescott's, I said, well, evidently he doesn't give a damn about all those values, and that there's another way that you can sort of really approach something from a rather cynical and satirical way that I really just related to. So that's my little secret life.
Rashid, when were you first introduced to Colescott's work, and what makes it so compelling to you and to artists of your generation? And could you talk a bit about the painting in your personal collection, 1993 painting called Blues for the Muse?
Yeah, I love this painting, and I love this work. I actually was introduced to Robert Colescott, and I believe it was 1999 or maybe 2000, so it was just a few years after he'd represented the U.S. in the Venice Biennale. We were both showing at a gallery in Chicago called G.R. Namdi Gallery, which professed to show black abstract painting. It was like, they were the place where black abstract painting more or less went to die, because I don't think anyone was participating much. And I met Robert, and Robert was a fascinating guy. By that time, he was already maybe a tad curmudgeon. Would you describe him that way in any way? Yes, maybe
Yeah.
a tad curmudgeon. And then, this is maybe an antiquated term, but do they call people tomcats? Like kind of a tomcat? Like,
Yes.
yes.
I didn't know anybody your age who would know that
I do know
term.
these words.
Okay.
I do. Anybody who doesn't know what that is, you could look it up after the talk. But he was a fascinating guy, and I really quite immediately fell in love with the work. And part of what brought me to it is not completely dissimilar from what brought Lowery to it. It flew in the face of respectability politics. It really pushed back at this idea that there was only one way to assimilate and to organize your thoughts and to organize your understanding of self. And I was blown away by that. It was something I'd never seen. It was so fresh and so satirical and so thoughtful and so transgressive, and it didn't have an innocent bone in its body. And it had absolutely no earnesty. And I think the thing that maybe makes an artwork just bad is when it's earnest, to be honest. When an artwork tells you that it's going to tell you the truth and that it has some sense of fact or some sense of understanding or is going to teach you something that's concrete, don't believe it, because it's almost never true. And anybody who would employ those tactics to make a picture is somebody whom you probably shouldn't be listening to or spending much time with. That's me being frank. But what Robert Colescott's work does is not that. It really kind of turns you upside down. It asks you questions that are going to embarrass you. It fillets people in front of your mother.
My mom is here.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, when pictures are able to do that kind of thing, when they're capable of being clumsy in that way, I think that they become really, really effective. And I think transgression is maybe sometimes overused, but I think it's really, really essential in understanding this artist project. And I was able to acquire this work just a few years back, maybe 5 years ago or so, just probably prior to there becoming even more enthusiasm for his project. But I'm just, still so excited. I was so excited to see Lowery's show that just stopped traveling. I think the last venue was the new museum, so hopefully a lot of people got to see his work there. But to see the kind of curatorial commitment that Lowery's had to this work, when you think about working with an artist for 40 years and being able to see their project against different backdrops and to be a supporter of that project against different backdrops, because these works lived one way in 1983. They live a very different life in 2023, right? And to be able to defend it against the different backlashes and the different sets of concerns and the different challenges that could be posed to this work over that period of time takes like the skill of a boxer. It's really floating like a butterfly and stinging like a bee to kind of navigate how this work kind of changed in the way that we organized ourselves towards this work and oriented ourselves towards this work, and how it evolves and how it kind of pierces different concerns that we have. So it's just, when a project can have as many lives as a project like this has, that's when it's successful. This is when we get into conversations around timelessness and how a project can kind of continue to teach us in different ways at different times.
Thank you. So this painting, entitled "Knowledge of the Past is Key to the Future: Some Afterthoughts on Discovery" from 1986, is currently on view in the Met's Levine Court. Lowery, Dr. Sims, could you please tell us about this work from the perspective of the curator who brought it into our collection? And could you talk about how the style of Colescott's work in the 80s is distinct from his work in the 70s with regard to technique?
Well, this painting, I got into the Met after about at least 10 tries. Mostly working with Bill Lieberman. I first wanted to show a work that was called Stella by Starlight. And essentially what it was a blonde woman draped all over a Frank Stella protractor sculpture. But it was just deemed, since Frank Stella was still alive, it was just deemed a little too much. So every time Bob had a show, I would sort of lug a painting in, and there's always a reason why not. But by the time he got to this knowledge of the past is the key to the future, I think that what had happened is that Bob's work became much more painterly than it was in the 70s. In the 70s, it was very flat, bright color, poster-like, glary. And also the compositions became a lot more dense and complicated. So we got this painting, and then we got a drawing for it. Bob accommodated us by doing watercolors, and then he annotated the watercolors, and then we did get a watercolor also for the knowledge of the past, the key to the future. Matthew Henson, sort of talking about the black man who got to the pole before Admiral Perry. And so I think that, it was kind of a relief to finally, get, something in the collection. I didn't know if it would ever go on the wall, but when I was here at the Met, I used to just collect stuff and hope for people like Akili would come along later and put them on the wall for me. So, this was like really so interesting, because instead of throwing a bomb into like the sort of myths of history, this one just sort of took it on. You know, you have Chris Columbus over here looking very innocent, you know, off to the whole thing. And behind him is Marcus Garvey. And then you have a Viking skeleton, you know, and then another Indian skeleton, and how all these people, a black man carrying a burden. You have Fra Bartolomeo, who was a very vicious imposer of Christianity on Indians. I mean, it's so rich. A black guy in a suit, you know, with a noose around his neck to sort of talk about the fertility of, you know, assimilation. Nothing, there is not a horizon line on the place, you know, that each figure seems to exist in its own space. And it was this time that I sort of realized that Colescott was really now moving around color shapes. It wasn't really just a narrative with figures. He was manipulating proportions within building. There wasn't that kind of like orderly, you know, entry into a space with a narrative. It was a whole bunch of narratives thrown on. And it reminded me of Henry Louis Gates's descriptions of Ishmael Reed's work, you know, in terms of narratives on top of narratives and, you know, sort of interlocking, you know, sort of dialogues that sort of went on. So, yeah, I'm really proud that we got this piece here. And I
It entered the collection just a year after it was made.
Yeah, yeah. We sometimes were able to do that back in those days.
Rashid, so Lowery wrote in a 2019 essay that Colescott, quote, indicates possible paths of resistance and creativity for artists who are marginalized or eliminated from the story of art because of their race, gender, or economic condition, political or social status. In your experience of his work as a painter and multidisciplinary artist, would you agree with that statement? What lessons have you learned from Robert Colescott?
And you don't have to. I used to write that about every artist that I... that was my famous ending for every artist that I wrote about.
Can you read it again for me, just quickly?
Yes. So, she says that Colescott indicates possible paths of resistance and creativity for artists who are marginalized or eliminated from the story of art because of their race, gender, economic condition, political, or social status. So I'm asking you, would you agree with that statement, and what lessons have you specifically learned from Robert Colescott's work?
Yeah, I agree. I'll start there. But, you know, it's super interesting. I've been thinking quite a bit about this idea of resistance, in particular in relationship to the black body and how we imagine kind of the black public-facing kind of position as an activist position, as a position of struggle, as a position of amplification, as a recognition of a people who have had to labor in order to find substantive opportunity. And the thing that often suffers in that depiction of black characters is the opportunity for quiet and the opportunity for interiority. When the expectation is for you to be publicly an activist, publicly presenting yourself in opposition to, within the context of struggle and with the ambition to produce change, when do you get to be quiet? And I'm not talking about silence, because silence and quiet are two quite different things. John Carlos in the Olympics in, was it 1972?
68.
68? I wasn't alive, so I don't know these things. I just read books.
I'm becoming the griot of the village up here.
Yeah, really.
Jesus.
Makes what is like a silent protest, right? It's an active position, but it's a silent protest. So I'm really kind of recognizing that my project aspires in some respects to kind of embrace that idea of quiet, and I really kind of rest on the back to some degree of artists like Robert Colescott, who had, like I mentioned earlier, this sense of dichotomy where there is this kind of legible kind of representation of struggle, right? And this way of reading it through a narrative structure and a way of kind of, making present these realities and these concerns. And in some ways, it makes space for artists like me to think about things that maybe we don't have the expectation for me to be concerned with. An investment in the existential, an investment in the quiet, the opportunity to whisper instead of yelling. And so, Robert's work really kind of, again, provides both of those opportunities. And having been able to witness that, I've gotten to choose a path and sometimes employ both of them myself. Sometimes it is more of a holler, and sometimes it is more of a whisper. And it's really open for interpretation, which is more effective.
So how do each of you respond to the discomfort that Robert Colescott's paintings can provoke? More specifically, Dr. Sims, how has Colescott's institutional reception shifted over the years? And Rashid, as a painter, does Colescott's paradigmatic discomfort figure into your own practice?
Well, I think that for myself personally, over the decades, the same paintings began to sort of present different kinds of concerns depending on what was going on in the society. I taught a course at the IFA on transgressive art and was really wrestling with the idea of presentism, like using the present to critique the past. And, particularly in the kind of really, sort of raunchy, outre, compositions of the 70s where he has secretaries in their underwears, Persians on desks of, their bosses. You have Tom and Eva, where Uncle Tom, the kindly, old, emasculated guy, is grabbing her butt. And a lot of the aforementioned translations of Robert Louis Stevenson's A Child's Garden of Verses, the way that in the 70s we might have had a kind of sardonic, anti-cultural sort of understanding, of those works, even if you are a woman, even if you are Black, it changed, as different kinds of things and that were simmering underneath the society sort of burst forward. So by the time we got to, I started organizing the show that opened in Cincinnati around 2013-14. That's when Rafaela Plato, who was the director then of the Contemporary Arts Museum in Cincinnati, contacted me about doing the show. By the time we had organized these different charrettes in the cities that he worked to, we got to Tucson in January of 2018. #MeToo. Dr. Nasser and the exploitation of the gymnasts at the University of Michigan. It was just like every day, how do you show certain paintings which had one kind of resonance, in the 70s and the 80s in this way? And it was a real kind of dilemma. The whole question of censoring is something that Bob's has me facing for a long time. When we were talking in the back, I was talking about in 1979 when I had temporary reins of the 20th Century Art Department after Tom Hess died and before Bill Lieberman took the chairmanship. I was doing a show of our visiting committee members, collections there, and Robert Rosenblum, the great art historian, and his wife, Jane Kaplowitz, had a Colescott painting, Eat Them Taters, which was based on Van Gogh's Potato Eaters. And I had just been to Semaphore, so I'm going, man, I could show the, the Colescott at the Met. Man, 1979. So we bring the painting into the galleries. My head technician calls me up and goes, okay, we're ready for you in the gallery, Lowery. Boy, you got a doozy down here. And so I go down, and the painting that looked kind of like modest in Bob Rosenblum's house, all of a sudden would look 5 times big in the clear-story galleries on the 2nd floor of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And I went, oh. 79, we were just, like the specter of Harlem on my mind was still there. And it's just like, oh my God. So I called up Herb Scott Gibson, head of the Community Programs Department. We sat and we looked at the painting for about 20 minutes. And Herb looked at me and he said, well, Lowery, you can hang that painting or you can have a quiet summer. The punchline is I opted for a quiet summer because Bob Rosenblum understood that there might be a problem here. Fast forward 2018, as we are getting loans, of course, I get from Jane Kaplowitz, are you sure are you gonna show it this time, Lowery? And it was so interesting because when it got into the galleries with, all the other Colescott paintings from the 70s, it looked much smaller than I remembered, So it's really been, kind of interesting. It's not that I really didn't believe in Colescott's enterprise, but I realized that my entry point on it came from a specific time period when I was a specific age and a specific stage in my life. But over the years, I've had to ebb and flow, with what was society, would accept for the paintings. I think that now that this George Washington Carver has, come to the Met and has been interpreted and sort of looked at in a different way, maybe that can sort of roll over to a lot of other paintings. But I can think of a couple of that probably never will be in polite company, if you know what I mean.
Rashid?
I'm going to try to remember what the question was.
The question was...
No, I think I can kind of capture
how does
it.
the discomfort figure into your work?
I feel so incredibly comfortable with Robert's work. And it's, I've already said several crude things, and Lowery kicked it off that way, so I'm going to allow myself and give myself some space to say something else maybe a little bit problematic. But it's almost as if, for me, Colescott is like my pornographer, He's like the person to whom I just don't criticize. I don't have kind of a critical eye to him. And I guess the reference point would be, if you're watching pornography, I don't go into the comment section, And some of you may. I don't. The fact that there is a comment section suggests that some of you are in it. But I don't, right? I just accept that it is what it is. And so that kind of acceptance of his project as a whole, that I'm just like, this guy is wild and can't be kind of captured, right? And so to unpack and to explore and to criticize and to change the backdrop and to reposition it and to say, well, when he did this, this was ritualistic and this is acceptable and this is a presentation that we can understand within the context of his practice, and then to dismiss other things seems like an arbitrary kind of process. I'm just kind of like, you buy in or you don't buy in, and we have an option. Yeah. Right? We have an option, and that's one of the great things that art provides us, is that it does not chain us to it. It gives you the chance to walk past it, right, and shut the hell up, or, open your mouth and take a position towards it, against it, or for it. But Robert's work lives there for me in a space where it just is what it is, and I'm bought in.
I wanted to get back to the second part of your question about institutional receptions of Bob's work. It's clear that, and I sort of recommend all of you to get Rick Powell's book, Going There, A Black Satirical Humor. He does a really good discussion of Bob Colescott. But one of the things that one had the assumption that Bob's work was disseminated mostly among private collectors and, a kind of like salty group, that knew him and had a very specific relationship with him. But back in like 2012 and 13, when we was first thinking about it, Matthew Wesley, who was my co-curator for the show in Cincinnati, we started collecting as much as we could information on collections of Bob's work. And the extraordinary thing that we found was that the works from the 80s and the 90s had an incredible institutional record.
Huge amount.
Huge. Now, I would sort of say that that is maybe due to the sort of sales skills of Barry Blindeman at Semaphore and Phyllis Kine, gallery. But they also, if you went on their website, sometimes they didn't have them on view. And it's really kind of interesting about how, say in the Portland Museum, which probably got a lot of Colescotts because of the Schnitzer family, and Arlene Schnitzer and her Fountain Gallery was one of the first places to show his work. And they had a painting that's called Rejected Advertisement for Drost Chocolate. And what Colescott did was he took a scene from Hans Brinker. So you assume this is Hans Brinker and his sister skating down the canal. Except Hans is an older white boy, and the sister is a young, black, winsome girl all done up in a Dutch thing. And Hans has his pants unzipped as he's going by, and his dick is, pointing at her. And I asked the people at the Portland Museum, have you ever shown that, And I didn't get an answer, So I think that there was a way that things came to institutions because of the particular collecting group that who had some influence that sort of allowed it to happen, gave the purchase money. But I think 5 minutes remaining, really? Okay. But I think that they now, I think the institutions now really sort of can bring out the work and sort of show it. But it was, just the Rubel collection alone, has, an incredible, including the video of the piece, this one, Du Lacroix. And so, yeah, he's almost like a kind of hidden treasure, in the storerooms of museums waiting to be exposed on the wall.
How did Colescott describe his identity? And does the fact that he passed as white until he was an adult have any bearing on the efficacy of his work as a critical practice?
I don't know what that means, but I'll tell you that people make a big deal about the fact that Colescott's family wanted to pass for white. But there are very few black families in this country that have not had at least one relative that has done that. It's not like something that never happens. And he was born in the 20s. His parents came from New Orleans, where you were allowed to have a certain kind of fluidity, you know, in your racial identification. You could
Creole.
Be Creole, whatever the hell that means. And so I think there was a lot of pressure, you know, like on him to do that. And when we talked to some of the people who knew him in Portland in the 50s and 60s, they said it never really came up until he went to Egypt. And you think about the fact that he was married to 6 women.
3 black
no,
women, 3 white women? Was it?
No, wait a minute, hold it. Is this, no, maybe, no, that's right. 4 white women, because he married one twice, and his last wife was black. It's very complicated. You know, he was doing that at a time where it was illegal to sort of have mixed marriages. So you kind of get, you know, that kind of feeling. But something about this opportunity to go and teach at the American Center in Egypt and being in that context in Cairo with all those people of different hues and things, and sort of seeing the pharaonic, you know, traditions in the arts, switched it around for him in a very way. And I remember I was saying backstage, Arlene Schnitz said to me one day, yeah, Bob, you know, he went to Egypt and one day he was white and the next day he was black, you know?
And that's really, in an interesting way, it's one of the things that even further kind of makes you recognize that Colescott is an artist who shouldn't be used as an activist vehicle, right? Because his project is quite personal, and it really is this exploration of self, like this deep, dark, bizarre exploration of self. And the fact that he, you know, I think he's really almost perfectly situated to talk about race in America, because he's witnessed conversations that I will never be privy to, you know? And the fact that he's had access in those locations and been able to witness certain kinds of conversations. I think he has a real kind of keen perspective to speak to how, you know, black people are seen in this country through different eyes, how he sees himself, and the fact that he's able to not only take that incredibly fertile ground and kind of push into that, but add sex to it, add, you know, different aspects of self to it, add travel to it, add picture making to it, add collage to it. Like, the fact that he's able to take something that's so fertile and not just stay there is a real kind of testimony to the kind of unbelievable kind of critical space that he occupies.
Thank you. On that note, please join me in thanking my colleagues Sylvia Yount, Mariana Siciliano, Sandra Jackson-Dumont, Ace Evans, and of course our panelists, Rashid Johnson and Lowery Stokes Sims. Thank you.